Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. When your entire army is made up of clones, there is one potential weakness, and that's their shared Fett DNA. It's something that the Separatist Alliance tries to exploit throughout the entire war, and it's something the Republic is trying to prevent the Separatists from exploiting throughout the entire war. In a recent episode, we looked at how the Separatist Alliance created an algorithm to predict the clone troopers' actions in combat. Apparently, their clone genetic makeup, and more importantly, the parts of their DNA that made them more docile and obedient, made the clone troopers a lot more predictable in combat. The clones in turn created their own battle algorithm to make themselves less predictable, but when the clone trooper Echo was captured with knowledge of this algorithm, the tide once again turned against the clones. So while these battlefield algorithms were successful in some ways against the clone army, it usually depended on capturing enemy soldiers or using the Separatist droid army's massive computing power. But what about something a bit more sinister? What if the Separatist Alliance targeted the clone army with some kind of biological weapon? Well, in 21 BBY, a completely unhinged FOSS scientist by the name of Nuvo Vindi was commissioned by the Confederacy of Independent Systems to re-engineer a virus known as the Blue Shadow virus. This was an extremely deadly disease with a 96% mortality rate against carbon-based life forms. It was incurable and usually killed within 48 hours. The only problem for Nuvo Vindi was the fact that the virus was only transmittable through water. Nuvo Vindi's goal was to make it airborne, which he was successful at doing. The Blue Shadow virus killed everything it touched and would be quite useful on a battlefield similar to the chemical weapons used during World War I. The Separatist military was mostly made of droids, so they would be unaffected by the weapon completely. Of course, this virus could also kill Separatist civilians if it fell into the wrong hands. But as far as we know, the Blue Shadow virus is not communicable, which means it won't spread from person to person, so it's still relatively easy for the Separatists to contain and use as a tactical weapon. So the Blue Shadow virus is actually similar in purpose to the Neimoidian-developed weapon known as the Defoliator. The Defoliator deployment tank, cleverly named DDT, fired projectiles that killed all organic matter in a large area, and can also be used to kill clones pretty efficiently while leaving droids completely unharmed. Now, both of these weapons are clearly terrifying, but they are tactical weapons, which means that they are designed for offensive or defensive uses. They're also usually short-ranged, affect a smaller area, and have immediate consequences. But the biggest fear of the Republic was that the Separatists would be able to bioengineer some very contagious virus that targets specifically humans, or if possible, specifically the Fett DNA. Now, in the terrific Republic Commando novel series, this is actually one of the first storylines. Shortly after the Battle of Genophage, a mega squad of the 05 Commando Battalion was sent on a mission to the planet of Krilloa. Their mission was to infiltrate a top-secret Separatist biolab, which was trying to create a nanovirus that targeted only the Fett DNA clones. Designed by human doctor Ovalant Quayle Uthan, the nanovirus, known as FG-36, was almost complete when the lab was destroyed by clone commandos. The only thing that Dr. Uthan hadn't figured out was how to attach this virus specifically to a gene that could be found only in clones but not in normal humans. And the gene she targeted was the one that accelerated their aging. The FG-36 virus was contained and ultimately sent to Palpatine to examine. It's probably one of the many factors which led to the dissolution of the clone army after the war. It should be mentioned that Dr. Uthan would eventually create an antigen for her own virus. Now, the idea of specific bioengineered viruses that can target specific portions of the human population is terrifying. I actually got this idea for this video after watching Designated Survivor, which is a TV show that doesn't exactly scratch my House of Cards itch, but it's an okay show. Anyway, one episode arc featured a South African scientist who wanted to create a virus that targeted people with dark skin pigmentation. Now, what this virus did was it would infect individuals and give them flu-like symptoms, but it wasn't a fatal virus. Instead, those that were infected would become sterile, which made me really think, how possible is something like this? Can a terrorist or extremist create a bioengineered disease that targets specific demographics? Well, one of the clearest examples of targeted biological warfare would be the use of smallpox in North America, mostly accidentally by European powers against Native Americans. It's estimated that as much as 95% of the indigenous population in the Americas died from the disease within a few generations of the European settlers arriving. Smallpox was a viral infection that enters the mouth or nose and eventually affects the respiratory system and eventually the lymphatic system. This was an extremely terrifying disease and it resulted in these pus-filled blisters that were very infectious and would cover your entire body. The disease had an incredibly high R0 of 6, which means that the average individual with smallpox would infect 6 people. In comparison, the seasonal flu has an R0 of just around 2. Now, smallpox was very infectious, not only because of the coughing and sneezing and the pus-filled blisters that could spread it, but also because it had a very long incubation period of around 12 days. Now, usually diseases that are very contagious like measles or even the coronavirus have relatively low mortality rates. Diseases with higher mortality rates are generally less contagious because they usually kill the host a lot quicker before they're able to spread it to someone else. And also the symptoms that do come on are pretty quick and very easy to spot, so it's easier to quarantine someone with that disease. What made smallpox so terrifying was that not only was it very contagious, it also had a very high fatality rate of around 30%. And those who survived were left with permanent scars over their bodies and oftentimes blindness. But amongst the native population, which had zero exposure or any kind of immune system developed to fight against the smallpox, the fatality rate was as high as 90%. Europeans had first contracted smallpox because of the agrarian societies they lived in, which meant constant exposure to domesticated animals, which was usually where such viruses mutated from. But in the New World, aside from the llama, there were very few large domesticated animals, and even so, the llamas were rarely eaten, which is kind of a mistake because they are delicious, and the llamas also weren't milked, which means there was less exposure and cross-contamination between humans and large mammals. Luckily, this disease was finally declared eliminated in 1980 worldwide, but just in the 20th century alone, smallpox was responsible for killing 300 million people. That's 3 times more than the amount of people killed in all of the wars during the 20th century. Now, when European settlers arrived in the New World, the spread of smallpox was mostly accidental. The world was a lot more isolated back then, which is what resulted in such a high death rate in the first place for the natives when compared to Europeans. Although it should be mentioned that there were cases of British troops gifting smallpox blankets to native tribal leaders. During the siege of Fort Pitt in the 1700s, biological warfare was actually discussed openly in correspondences between British officers. Now, today in our more connected global environment, it's less likely you'll find such a large difference in immune systems between different demographics. So what is the possibility of someone being able to create a specific type of virus in a lab that targets certain demographics? Now, obviously, you can't target someone by their religion or political beliefs because genetically speaking, there are no markers associated with such things. But what about targeting a specific race of people? Well, the idea of race is already pretty controversial. And there's a lot of misinformation and confusion involved in this entire idea. For instance, in the early 20th century, by using phenotypes or observable characteristics, the white race was subdivided into 3 or 4 subraces depending on hair color, skin color, and eye color. In the mid-20th century, the idea of 5 different races was established by anthropologist Carlston S. Kuhn. Now, all of these earlier racial classifications were mainly reliant on physical appearance and other types of phenotypes, which actually makes up a very small portion of our genetic makeup. But finally, in 2003, the Human Genome Project was completed, giving us a far clearer and more scientific understanding of race at a genetic level. What researchers found was this old concept of there being just 5 races was actually, genetically speaking, very flawed. For one, all humans on Earth have a genome that's 99% identical to every other human. More importantly, individuals in so-called racial categories have as much variance with each other as they do with people in other races, which is why most geneticists today look at these racial categories as invalid. Now, of course, ethnicity and ancestry is a real thing, and there are certain ailments that will affect certain groups. For instance, in certain areas of the world where malaria is relatively common, there seems to be a higher rate of people born with sickle cell trait and sickle cell disease. While having the sickle cell trait will make individuals more resistant to malaria infections, individuals with a more serious sickle cell disease are more susceptible to a lot of different types of infections. For instance, studies show that the H1N1 swine flu was far deadlier for children with sickle cell disease, and that children with sickle cell disease are 80 times more likely to be hospitalized when they contract the seasonal flu. So the scary truth is, as we find out more about the human genome and what our DNA is made out of, hostile actors and evil actors are also more likely to learn about how to exploit these very minute differences in different ethnic groups. But even if they are able to construct some type of genophage, that genophage will most likely have to target very specific things. And as we determined before, the differences between one person and another is very, very minuscule. And more importantly, the more traditional views of race that might be used by these hostile actors when determining which demographic they want to attack will no longer be genetically viable. Which means a genophage that they think will affect Asians, for instance, might equally affect Caucasians and other races. Which is why I ultimately believe in this concept of humanity first, because it's kind of futile to spend energy trying to kill your fellow man, because at the end of the day, we're all very, very similar. And our energy is probably better spent fighting against far more sinister foes like the blue monkeys from Pandora or dolphins. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video and that it didn't freak you out too much. Biological warfare definitely terrifies me in some ways. But if you did like this video, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our interesting content. Well guys, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.